I'm Any New Province, and this week I want to find out if Baloth Gorger is possibly Pauper Playable. Baloth Gorger is a 4-mana 4/4 beast that was new with the release of Dominaria. These stats on a green 4-drop is not unheard of in the Pauper format. What makes Baloth Gorger unique is that it has Kicker 4, which means you may pay an additional 4 mana as you cast this spell. If you do, Baloth Gorger enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. At worst, we're going to be getting a creature that passes the vanilla test, which makes it just a little bit better than Kavu Primarch, and you don't even have to build around a Convoke ability. This deck comes from Reddit user Shigazane, who thought it would make an appropriate home for Baloth Gorger. This is their take on a Pauper version of the modern deck, Titan Shift. I made a few changes to the 75 to suit my playstyle, but if you want to see how Shigazane originally put this deck together and read about how they think matchups will shape up and how you should sideboard, I'll link the Reddit post in the description down below. The idea behind this deck is using tons of efficient ramp spells to get as many lands as possible on the battlefield to cast massive threats. I'm going to start the deck tech off with our favorite threat, and the reason I'm calling this deck Auroch Shift. Auroch's Herd costs 5 and a green for a 4/4 with trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an Auroch's card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Red and green are colors that definitely struggle to make any kind of raw card advantage. That's why it's awesome that Auroch's Herd goes into your library and finds another copy of itself. What makes that even better is that whenever Auroch's Herd attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking Auroch. While I would love to be casting Aurochs all game, every game, we may not necessarily find them, so we included some other high mana cost threats to get the job done. First, we have Greater Sandworm, which costs 5 green for a 7/7, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. This is kind of an interesting version of Evasion that I think Wizards was toying around with as a replacement for Trample. If you don't have 7 mana to cast your Greater Sandworm, you can even just cycle it away for 2 and look for one of your ramp spells instead. Our most expensive threat is Ulamog's Crusher. It costs 8 mana for an 8/8 Eldrazi with Annihilator 2, which means whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. Ulamog's Crusher does attack each combat if able, but that's not a big deal. It's an 8/8, so it can attack through most boards. I'm happy to have at least one copy of Ulamog's Crusher in our deck, especially for when games go late. Some decks can't afford to be sacrificing a creature or a land every turn, and more than that, Ulamog's Crusher is just going to crush in for 8 damage every turn until they're dead. Our last ramp payoff isn't a creature, but it's just as potent as one, if not more so. It's Rolling Thunder. It costs X red, and it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of targets at sorcery speed. If you've ever played against a Tron deck in Pauper, you've got to be aware of the power of Rolling Thunder. Players can use this as a board wipe or as a single fireball spell that ends the game immediately. Next, I'm going to talk about our ramp package, the spells that we're going to use to hit our land drops faster than our opponent and power out a huge threat before they have the resources to deal with it. First, we have Calmly Heart Expedition. It costs 1 green for an enchantment with a landfall ability, which means whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a quest counter on Calmly Heart Expedition. Remove 3 quest counters from Calmly Heart Expedition and sacrifice it. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. I really like Calmly Heart Expedition because it pays you off for continuing to play the game while you're casting your ramp spells on later turns. Also, Calmly Heart Expedition synergizes really well with itself. If you have one of these on the battlefield ready to pop and you commit another one, you've got 2 quest counters on it. You just have to make a single other land drop to make sure you can sacrifice it and go search your library for another 2 land. Next, we have Sakura Tribe Elder, probably better known as Steve. It costs 1 and a green for a 1/1 for a Snake Shaman that you can sacrifice to search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Steve is one of the best ramp spells available in any format. The reason it's so good is because you can put it in front of one of your opponent's creatures before you sacrifice it to search for a land. That means whatever damage that creature's trying to do will be prevented. Our last bit of ramp is a playset of Search for Tomorrow. It costs 2 and a green for a sorcery that lets you search your library for a land and put it onto the battlefield untapped. That wouldn't be super great, but it does have Suspend 2. Instead of casting this card from your hand, you can pay 1 green mana to exile it with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter. When the last time counter is removed, you get to cast Search for Tomorrow and ramp with it without paying its full mana cost. Besides using Auroch's Herd, we really lean into the graveyard synergies available to this color combination to generate some extra value. That value package begins with Tilling Treefolk. It costs 2 and a green for a 1/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return 2 land cards from your graveyard to your hand. Another spell that's great at generating value out of the graveyard is Pulse of Marasa. It costs 2 and a green for an instant that returns target creature or land card from your graveyard. You also gain 6 life. Tilling Treefolk and Pulse of Marasa can be useful by pulling things out of your graveyard that would end up there in a normal game of Magic anyway. However, we are using red spells that will put targets in the graveyard specifically for them. First, we have Tormenting Voice, which costs 1 and a red for a sorcery that draws you 2 cards. It sounds great, but there is a drawback. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you have to discard a card. We're also playing Faithless Looting, which costs 1 red for a sorcery that draws you 2 cards and lets you discard 2 cards. You can also flash it back out of your graveyard for 2 and a red, which means you can cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost. You exile it afterwards. These looting and rummage effects really help the ramp strategy smooth itself out. We might draw the wrong half of our deck, and these cards will allow us to find exactly what we need at the right time. Meanwhile, our Tilling Treefolk and Pulse of Marasa can make sure we have enough cards in our hand at all times to ship away to our looting. We're also running a little bit of interaction. Most of the time, we want to interact with our opponents by running over their creatures, but sometimes we're going to have to go straight to their faces. We have 2 copies of Lightning Bolt, which costs 1 red and deals 3 damage to any target. The only reason I didn't max out on Lightning Bolt is because we can potentially do a little bit more damage with this other spell that synergizes well with our graveyard. It's called Firebolt, and it costs 1 red for a sorcery that deals 2 damage to any target. You can also flash it back out of your graveyard for 4 and a red. One of the other things that drew me to this deck is the toolbox that it plays with its land cards. We can turn our lands into a toolbox using this spell, Crop Rotation. I'll go over the land cards we're ideally tutoring up with Crop Rotation next. First, we have Colony Garden, which enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, it creates a 0/1 plant creature token. When it becomes untapped, it adds a green. Colony Garden is great for soaking up edict effects. Even if our opponent is casting one at instant speed, we can still use Crop Rotation to go get a plant token right on time. I've also included a Radiant Fountain that enters the battlefield and gains you 2 life. It only taps for a colorless, but we're very heavy into green, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find the red mana we need on time anyway. We have Sajiri Step, which adds white mana even though we don't have any white spells in the deck. This is for protecting our creatures from removal. It does that by entering the battlefield and giving target creature you control protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Our final utility land is Smoldering Spires. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature can't block this turn. If we can trigger this kind of ability multiple times, we can falter our opponent's board and get in with lethal with all of our huge creatures. The rest of our non-basic lands start with our Karus. They're Gruul Turfs. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, we have to return a land we control to our hand, but when they become untapped, they add green and red. We're also running cycling lands in red and green. You can pay a green or a red, respectively, to discard them from your hand and draw a new card. We're also running Evolving Wilds. These synergize super well with Colony Garden and get us our red mana on time. Evolving Wilds can be tapped and sacrificed to search your library for a basic land card to put it on the battlefield tapped. Finally, for our basic lands, we're running 7 forests and 2 mountains. We want a lot of untapped green sources so that we can suspend our Search for Tomorrows on turn 1 and hit a Colony Garden Expedition right on time. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have 2 Pyroblasts for fighting those blue decks and for forcing our creatures through counter magic. We have 1 Wicker Bough Elder for destroying all of our opponent's enchantments and artifacts. We have 2 Nylea's Disciples for gaining us a ton of life if we have a Baloth Gorger on board. We have 2 Relic of Progenitus for controlling any other slow deck's graveyard. We have 2 Penumbra Spiders to eat our opponent's edicts. We have 2 Gorilla Shamans for blowing up all of Affinity's lands. We have a number of Wraths, starting with Swirling Sandstorm, Electric and another Rolling Thunder to pick everything off. Finally, we have a single Fog for those hyper-aggressive decks in Moment's Peace. We can cast this a couple of times as we attack for lethal with our huge creatures. And there you have it, Auroch Shift by Shigazane. We're going to take this deck live into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic Time. We're there every Tuesday night playing Possibly Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.